You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. My very special guest today is Jason Smart. Jason's been on the No Delusion Zone before, and I'm very glad to have him back again. He's a geopolitical analyst and political consultant who specializes in pretty much all things Russian history, culture, language, the Russian military, intelligence services, politics. And for the last at least 2.5 years, if not more, he's been talking almost exclusively about the war in Ukraine, of course. He can regularly be seen doing podcasts and writing articles for the Kyiv Post. And if you haven't seen him there or read any of his articles, I very much encourage you to go to KyievPost.com and check out his articles and podcasts there. They are excellent. So without further ado, Jason, welcome back to the No Delusion Zone.
David, really great to see you. Thank you so much.
You bet. You bet. Well, obviously, we've gone through a very, how shall I say, traumatic experience here with the recent election results. And everyone, including myself, are just kind of waking up from the, I won't say nightmare, but I'll say the trauma. But as you said, and we talked about this off air, hey, it's the new reality. And if those of us who support Ukraine, which you and I both do, we need to understand that. We need to accept the fact that Donald Trump's going to be the president again, and he's going to control both houses of Congress. And we need to get with the program if we really want to help Ukraine, instead of just calling him names and saying we're going to, as you said, I think, wear pink hats and protest in the street and boo-hoo-hoo. So let's talk about that to open the show. That's the 800-pound gorilla here in this room anyway, as far as I'm concerned. In your opinion, what do you think, or how do you think the Trump presidency, the new Trump administration come January 20th, is going to treat the war in Ukraine? How do you see this developing? Are we going to see dramatic changes in U.S. support for Ukraine after Trump is inaugurated?
So one of the benefits of Donald Trump in this situation is that there's a high degree of what's not predictable. We simply don't know. And that ambiguity as to what's next is something that makes Russia nervous. And it's something I think actually gives Ukraine an advantage at this point. Ukraine itself obviously doesn't know what Trump is going to do. Nobody knows clearly what Trump is going to do. But we all know that Trump sometimes does things that shock the world. We saw that in his relationship with North Korea as an example. So what could happen here is that Trump simply comes into this, realizes that Russia is not the country that perhaps he thought it was, or that those who are his critics accuse him of thinking it is, but rather he realizes it is a country that is working against him. And it really is, in a very literal sense. Since Trump won the elections, we've seen on national TV in Russia how they've mocked him, how they've put up nude photos of his wife, mocked her as well. We've seen how the Patrushev, one of the top intel guys in Russia, he came out and he said that we essentially made the implication that they had helped Trump to win the election, and now Trump has certain obligations to them. Now, why would he make a public statement? Even if that was true, there are ways to privately communicate that. And the reason they did this was to embarrass Donald Trump. We've seen again and again and again that the Russian authorities have sought to go out of their way to embarrass Donald Trump and to humiliate him. And in my eyes, that's great. I'm actually delighted to see that, because Donald Trump is somebody who might very well come back and really strike back hard. Now, let's continue down this line, though. There's something else at play here. In the past couple of years, which is different from the last time that Trump was in power, the unification of China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia is more solid than ever. Iran is obviously an enemy of Donald Trump, and he's felt that way forever. We see the relationship with Israel. We know that Donald Trump very strongly supports Israel as well. But it's Iran that's really tossing things up around the world. More than that, there's been people arrested in the United States for attempting to assassinate Donald Trump with the assistance of Iranian intelligence. So I can hardly believe that Donald Trump is going to enter this and try to open up new pathways and better relationships with people who are trying to kill him. And who are their best allies? Moscow. And let's look at who else Donald Trump has singled out. We have the Chinese. The Chinese now are working with his enemies, with Iran. They're working with Russia. And in both cases, we know that Russia has worked with international terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah, organizations that he also hates. It's more and more clear who is really operating inside the Kremlin. And it is a person who is hell set to make sure that he can create global chaos. And I think that Donald Trump now, it's clear for everybody that before had any doubts, that this is not about Ukraine. This war is not about Ukraine. This war in Ukraine, I would argue, in the eyes of the Kremlin, is simply a battle in what is a global war that is occurring. We've seen it in the 3 countries in Africa that have been overthrown, whether it's Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso. We see it propping up the regimes in places like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Russia is active around the world, countering U.S. influence, and specifically attacking Donald Trump. So in my eyes, no, it makes no sense whatsoever for anybody to just be throwing rocks at Trump at this point. He won the elections. He won the House. He won the Senate. The Supreme Court is controlled by conservatives. The fact is, it makes much more sense to figure out what we can do at this time to advance Ukraine's interest than it does to sit and complain about what maybe hypothetically would have been a better option. That's not an option and should be forgotten. Let's focus on what we can do now to help Ukraine.
Of course, I agree with everything you said. My next question, though, Jason, is forget about Trump and what he believes. I don't think he really has an agenda. As you know, he's very impulsive. But more importantly, what do you think, or do you believe that those around Trump, his closest advisors, will be able to connect the dots that you just connected about Russia's real ambitions around the world and their allies now, China and Iran, North Korea? Do you think that Trump's advisors are able to connect those dots and are willing to take the actions necessary to confront them? The political will.
So when we look at the people around Donald Trump, yeah, of course, there's some of them that have said things that I would say at the very least are questionable as far as to support for Ukraine. But that all being said, I think it's malleable. I do not think those are things that are hard fast. If you look at anyone in any cabinet at any time in the history of the world, in any government, it's always the same. You've limited political capital, and where do you want to spend it? And for the vast majority of people, when they get power and they're around someone like a president, they want to spend it on domestic issues, because those are what really matter to them. They want to have deregulation of the industry that they work in. They want to make sure they can affect the laws that affect the business that they'll be in after they leave power. They're far less interested in something global like international relations. So as much as I love IR, and I really think it's fascinating, I understand for the vast majority of people that come to power, they're much more interested in the policies that they feel and touch day in, day out in the United States. And so I think that Donald Trump, especially someone like Marco Rubio, who I have great respect for, I think is going to be quite aggressive. We've seen what Rubio said in the past. We've seen his stalwart support for Ukraine. And I have no reason to believe at this point that though there might be some people that are sort of loudmouth that say things in social medias, that's not the position of the Trump administration. And so far, the Trump administration has already come out and said, when people have spoken out of line, that is not the position of the administration, specifically in case referring to Ukraine. So I think that there is still hope. There's not a reason to be losing it or thinking it's the end of the world. Listen, I think that the guy has won the election, and no matter what anyone would have preferred, you should give him a fair shake. He said that he's going to go into this, he's going to talk tough with Putin, and no matter what misgivings you might have, he is the president of the United States, and we should give him space to try to negotiate what is best in America's national interest, which is a strong Ukraine that can defeat our enemies, including Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China.
Well, I have to say that with the exception of Marco Rubio, whom I agree with you, I think he's going to be, I don't know, a great a Secretary of State. I think he's going to be good. I don't have any serious qualms about him, but I'll have to also say that the rest of them are clowns. I'm sorry, they're disgraceful. I can't get even more passionate than that right now. I really just can't. I mean, what do you think old Hegseth's going to do? Old Pete at the Department of Defense. You think he's going to be a real staunch supporter of Ukraine? Or, I mean, just as an example, this is not a great selection for the SecDef. What do you think about him and moving forward with support for Ukraine?
I think with any cabinet, remember, Trump still legally and technically has not nominated anybody, because only a president can nominate somebody to be in a cabinet position. So these are names that are being floated. These are names that he says he intends to nominate. And there's still a lot of time. There's still another 60 days before Trump takes office. So I think there is a good chance that things will change from what the current lineup is. Second to that, I think that a lot of people take very public positions that are one thing that might be good for the audience in the United States, populism, let's say, to excite the conservative base. But at the same time, once you become the head of a service in the United States, such as the Pentagon, you are receiving daily intelligence briefs. You're no longer seeing this through the partisan scope that, Ukraine is just endless billions being thrown away. No, you're not seeing that. You're seeing that U.S.'s enemies are being destroyed while far away, far from American shores. at a very low cost. In fact, less than 5% of the Pentagon's budget per year goes to aid for Ukraine. And of that money, the vast majority of what we send Ukraine is not new equipment. Rather, we're sending stuff that's old, obsolete, stuff that is slated to be destroyed, which actually cost us more money to destroy than to simply send to Ukraine. So I think if you're the Secretary of Defense and you realize we can destroy the capacity of our enemy's military at 5% of the Pentagon budget or less, you're getting a great deal. And so I do think that there's a lot of room for things to still change.
Well, if he gets into what it's called recess appointments, he's going to shove these people through. However, I understand what you're saying. And the latest news I heard, though, makes me even a little bit more scared. I understand that today, later on today, Trump is going to announce that he is proposing an emergency executive order, which will bring Matt Gaetz into the U.S. Army as a 4-star general and make him the commanding general of SOCOM. I just made that up. However, I don't think that it's beyond the realm of possibility. I'm sorry. It's been so crazy. Matt Gaetz in the government at all, especially as an AG or just anywhere near law enforcement or investigations. I'm sorry. I'm still getting over that one. However, let's move on to support for Ukraine. What about NATO? I mean, it's kind of the same thing. I think I know what you're going to say, but once the inauguration takes place, where do you see the U.S. vis-a-vis NATO and all of the many threats Trump has made in the past, as well as many of his supporters about either withdrawing most or all U.S. support for NATO?
Well, as you know, the Senate and the House passed legislation last year that prevents the president from withdrawing from NATO unilaterally. It has to go through the Senate. And the guy who put that law together was Marco Rubio. He was one of the chief people behind that. So I don't think that we're leaving NATO anytime soon. More than that, I think that if we look at the way it went down with NATO last time, Donald Trump did complain a lot about it. But I don't think that's totally unfounded. I think that's part of a strategy to try to get NATO to pay up more. Because in the end of the day, did we take a single move to leave NATO? We did not take a single move. He complained a lot they weren't paying enough, which is true. 2% is not a huge amount, and plenty of the countries were not. But in the end, did it have a result? Well, yeah, a lot of the countries started increasing the amount that they were spending on their militaries, which is good. Europe, for its own security, should absolutely have its own defense mechanism. It can't just rely on the United States. And as we see now in the situation of the Ukraine, it's sort of absurd when everyone's worried, well, what happens in the United States will decide the future of Ukraine. Why should it? Europe is massive. Europe has no excuse whatsoever that it cannot have a large enough military-industrial complex to be able to defend itself and to help Ukraine, and not only be reliant on the United States.
I agree with you. Again, I've been railing against NATO for years, and that's one of the few topics that I agree with Trump about, and always have. The other one is immigration, but that's not the topic of today's episode. Jason, do you think that, well, look, the U.S. is going to withdraw some or a lot of its support for NATO, or for Ukraine. That's just in the cards. How much, nobody knows. Do you think that Europe, NATO, is going to be able to fill the gap for what the U.S. withdraws? And if so, do you believe they're going to be able to do it fast enough to save Ukraine from not falling to Russian forces?
So we can break that down a few different ways. I think that Europe absolutely does have the capacity to assist Ukraine far more than what it currently is. But second to that, I think there's a very good chance that Ukraine would always have the door open by the United States to be taking out loans to buy more military hardware. The U.S. has a vested interest in having people buy our hardware. That's good for our economy. And to give loans to others to do that, it's also good for our economy. So there's not a problem in doing this. And even Donald Trump has signaled that he's interested in that. But let's look further. I think that if we were to look at how we got here today, it was a policy in the past 2.5 years by the Biden administration to decide to not send Ukraine what it needed in order to fight Russia back. In the early days of the war, if you look back, New York Times, Washington Post, the articles, even 6 months after the full-scale invasion began, routinely the National Security Council of the White House was quoted as saying, we don't want to see the Russian lines break. We don't want to see chaos in the Russian military. We don't want to see a bunch of Russian soldiers lose heart and start running towards Moscow. One situation after another where they were worried more about the state of the Russian military than they were about the state of the Ukrainian military. Back then, Russia had not laid out landmines as they have now. It is going to be much harder, for instance, to liberate Crimea than it would have been 2.5 years ago. But that was a decision of the administration to not escalate, not allow Ukraine to really fight back and to tie their hands. Just in the past few days, Ukraine has gotten the ability to use ATACMS, the very small quantity that they have, but it's so limited. Kursk Oblast, and specifically to send a signal to North Korea to not send more troops. So let's look at what this means for the long term. Ukraine does not have the capacity to endlessly fight a war when it's being bled dry. It's not being given the weapons necessary to attack Russian targets further away, which prevents them from coming into actual combat with Ukraine. If we can destroy Russian soldiers and Russian military equipment further away from Ukraine, that saves Ukrainian lives. Because for Ukraine, a country that's free population today, those who live in the unoccupied territories within the territory of Ukraine today, it's only about 23 million people. They're up against Russia. This has 140 million people. There's simply less people in Ukraine. We can't afford to lose lives. And by choosing to not arm Ukraine, not giving it everything it needed to truly fight back, it has given Ukraine a great disadvantage. So the best thing that could happen now is if the White House in these waning days were to make the correct decision, to send Ukraine absolutely everything that they can, and further to take off all these absurd limits they put on Ukraine that are just costing every single day dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of lives within Ukraine.
Well, you've made, a few excellent points here. One of them that has not been made by the Biden administration, one of many, is what that you said. American contractors have and could make even more money from selling the weapons that Ukraine needs. So when the American people, or especially some in the Republican Party, say that Ukraine is bleeding us dry, which is absurd, you just laid out the percentage there before, how low it is. They don't talk about, the Biden administration hasn't talked about the amount of money that can be brought into the United States to more than offset anything that we have given to Ukraine, which, as you said, is mostly drawn from equipment and ammunition and supplies that we no longer use. But that hasn't been done. And the same thing hasn't been done, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, within NATO. And they are now just starting, I think, to get the idea that, hey, they have to defend themselves now, and they're dusting off their peacetime economies in their factories to try to defend themselves. There's been some stories recently about pamphlets, booklets, articles that have been put out by the government within the Nordic nations about preparing for war. Something that came out during the Cold War has been dusted off now. Do you think that the Trump administration can make that argument to the American people once he is in office that, hey, folks, MAGA, this is going to actually be a profit to America? It's not draining us. It's actually going to make us more money.
Yeah, absolutely the case. One thing that I simply have never understood about the Biden administration was its poor communication. And throughout this war, routinely you would see in the news a year ago, at least, another 60 million for Ukraine, another 120 million for Ukraine. But nobody understood what that was for. If you ask the rank and file person, okay, we're going to send a bunch of X weaponry. Why? What does it achieve? How does it bring Ukraine closer to victory? Oh, and further, not just why, so people understand it's not money just disappearing. How many jobs that created in America? How did that boost our economy? What were the pluses? The state of Arkansas produced part of that. Ohio produced another part. Pennsylvania, another part. They could have explained this well enough so people understood why supporting Ukraine, even if you're totally disinterested in the country of Ukraine, you should know that the American economy is gaining from this. And let's look at the indirect benefits. Look at Europe, how much it's built up its military in the past couple of years due to the war in Ukraine. Guess where they're buying their weaponry from? The United States. We have sold tons and tons of weaponry due to this. This has worked in our interest if you want to look purely economically. So to not mention that, to just somehow not bring that up, is absurd. It's something that we should always talk about. The United States is not losing on this. I mean, more important though, even than making the money, is this protecting American lives. This means American soldiers will not be fighting on foreign shores because Ukraine is fighting our enemies for us. And I think the value of American soldiers' lives is far, far greater than trying to save some dollars at the Pentagon. Keep in mind, less than 5% of the Pentagon's budget. I much prefer to spend 5% of the Pentagon's budget to destroy America's enemies while they're far away than to lose 5% of our soldiers in needless combat.
No, you're absolutely right. And I can't still believe that the Biden administration never got that point across, because I'm sorry, I know that the vast majority of the American people, whether they're on the left or the right, believe that America has sent far more money to Ukraine than we've ever gotten back, and that the number is much, much, much higher than it actually is. And they have no idea, like you just said, what are we sending? What's the plus side? What's the upside for us now and in the long term? They're just such poor communicators about that. But again, I agree with you about Europe. The spending that has now happened, the GDP towards their defense economies is staggering. Poland being, an incredible example, as well as the Baltic countries. What do you think about the pamphlets, the information that's been put out recently in the last few days, actually, by the Nordic countries to tell their citizens to start prepping for a possible war with Russia in the next few years?
Of course, it's very good that countries take seriously the threat that's here. And I think that's something that unfortunately the United States never did enough of either, is to bring to people's attention how high the stakes really are. And I think the Nordic states realize that Russia has a long history with them, and it knows that it's a belligerent neighbor. It knows it's a neighbor that is actively working against it. And it's not always going to be in, kinetic warfare or conventional warfare. It's not going to be always just land invasions. Just this week, Russia cut off the cables, underwater cables connecting Finland to Europe and other underwater cables. These are all part of Russia's global war, and it's being waged today. And we can keep our heads in the sand and say, well, we don't want escalation. We don't want a war with Russia. But Russia has chosen to have a war with us. It doesn't ultimately matter what we think or what we want. And if you look at World War I, World War II, the United States and plenty of European countries thought, well, we'll sit this one out. We'll let them duke it out, but we don't need to get involved in this. That's great. But it's sort of like saying, I don't want my house to be robbed, so I'll just, prefer that they don't break in. If the guy's going to break into your house, he's made the decision. It doesn't matter what you want. The question is, are you prepared? Are you going to be able to defend yourself? Or are you just going to wait for him to waltz in there and take over your house? In this case, we have the same thing. We can be prepared for what is already taking place, which I've argued more than once is not World War III, but it's World War IV. In the eyes of Vladimir Putin, the Soviet Union lost World War III, which was the Cold War. In that war, Russia realized fighting another war like World War II was not going to be realistic. That sort of large-scale conventional warfare, it's a massive cost of money as well as lives. But more than that, the West, especially the United States, spent so much money in the development of new technologies throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s till today. Russia has no hope of catching up with that. And it knows that a NATO war would be something that would destroy it. So it is a much better strategy today. And it's a strategy that we're seeing take place around the world, which is taken directly from the Cold War, which is they operate using asymmetrical warfare, using information operations, using sabotage, arson, assassinations to around the world create chaos. In fact, one of the top ideologues of the Kremlin wrote something a few years ago called "Where is the Chaos Gone?" and the need for Russia to export chaos. And they are actively doing that. And so people don't seem to draw a link that 20% of Syria's population is now located inside of Europe. How'd that happen? Who's bombing Syria? Oh, of course, they had a civil war backed by the Russians. And who's helping all the Syrians get in there? Well, it's going to be the Russians helping them get to Europe. And guess what? The far-right political parties like AfD in Germany or Le Pen in France benefit from that. That's something that Russia wants to see. Look at the United States. Typically, in illegal immigrants caught on the U.S. border, southern border, only about 1% were from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua before. In the past couple of years, it surged to 21% of encounters on the border. How that happened? Well, all those countries have something in common. Those are countries that Russia works with. Creating immigration crises, like we saw with Belarus in 2022, with the border to Lithuania, the border with Poland, they brought Arab migrants to the borders. It was to strike up local concerns. And people become more concerned about what's going on domestically, illegal immigration, than what's going on internationally. Not putting two and two together. They're directly linked. Russia is operating globally. Look at the case of Latin America. We know as a fact that Iran helps to launder money with the drug cartels. Not a question, a fact. Islamic terrorist organizations operate in Latin America. If you look it up, in fact, you'll see that Hezbollah, one of the biggest places in the world, is South America. And guess what? If you work with the drug cartels and the coyotes that work with the sending of illegal immigrants, you start to realize, well, what do they have in common? Well, you have sanctioned countries like Russia and North Korea and Iran. But you also have sanctioned organizations like the drug cartels that can't do business with anybody else. And so who do they work with? Well, they work with people like Hezbollah, also sanctioned. They can all work together, create a common economy, and serve common interest, which is to break down the West's ability to control law and order, which opposes their livelihood.
Jason, I'm going to wrap this up with one question, and it's a two-parter. So please let me get to this. You have a bead on the Russian, and before that, the Soviet state of mind, how their MO, like you were just talking, the chaos theory, their intelligence services, their strategy, and right now, their global strategy. So two-part question. First of all, if we can't, when I say we, those that maybe did not vote for Trump cannot convince or goad Trump into being aggressive with Vladimir Putin and actually doing what needs to be done to stop him. And he somehow goes through on some crazy deal where he does allow Putin to keep all of these seized territories in Donbass and Crimea and make up some kind of a crazy agreement where Ukraine never joins NATO and so forth and so on. So first part of the question is, do you believe that Putin is going to honor any agreements that he makes with Trump or NATO, and that he will not, in fact, just bulldoze through the rest of Ukraine and then on to Eastern Europe through Moldova, Georgia, and the Baltics and so forth? And if so, part two, how can you explain what that will mean to the American people so they can understand that this is just not some isolated war in a country that they can't even find on a map?
So first and foremost, we can say with absolute certitude that Vladimir Putin cannot be trusted. He lies through his teeth and he smiles while he does it. The guy is dishonest, and Russia has shown routinely that they make a mockery of international diplomacy, international law. They use it to their advantage because they know that we bind ourselves to it and are unwilling to do a lot of things that they are happy to do. And they take advantage of our naive nature. But more than that, I think that it's unrealistic that we would see a full collapse of Ukraine. And it's for a different reason. Let's imagine that Donald Trump did exactly what you said. Let's imagine he just said, Ukraine's not my problem. We're pulling out totally. I don't foresee that happening, but let's just play with it. I don't see that happening for another reason that's just much more simple. The total collapse of Ukraine would be far more significant and far worse and gain far more attention than the total collapse of Afghanistan. That was a total disaster for the Biden administration, a black stain. And for Trump to allow that to happen is his poor decision to create something that would be a disaster talked about for years to come. I think he realizes that doesn't work in his interest. Much cheaper, much easier is to try to settle down the situation now. Now, I absolutely do not believe that Putin is willing to take negotiations seriously, and I don't really believe he wants to end the war right now. That being said, if they were to begin negotiations, I think that there is a chance that they could find at least a reason for a ceasefire at this moment. And at that point, I think that Putin would immediately begin to rebuild. And I think there's two things that we would see. I think that anything that is said about security guarantees is sort of irrelevant. Putin is not really worried about that. That's just pretext. The reason he talks about NATO is pretext. The reality is Putin needs time to rebuild. He also needs sanctions taken off his economy. Inflation in Russia is above 28%. When you go to a bank now to take out a loan, it's above 21% interest rate. Typically, you have to put down more than 50% in order to buy a house. Things are getting really dicey in Russia. Just look at their economy. The ruble is also probably going to be devalued soon. The cost of a barrel per oil under Trump is going to drop down. Trump has said he's going to drill. And that's one thing that I think we all support because it will really hurt Russia. If oil prices are less than $72 per barrel, the Russian economy starts to go into deficits. And it looks like the current projection is that it might reach $50 per barrel. So what does it mean in real terms? Well, the ruble, which is about 100 to the dollar right now, would have to be devalued to about 122 to 155 to dollar in order to have a stabilized budget. But that also means that people don't have any more assets. They've lost 22 to 35% of their money due to devaluation on one side, 28% due to inflation on the other side. And keep in mind, the average Russian spends more than 50% of their money on food costs. In contrast, the average European only spends about 15%. So I think that if we can destroy the Russian economy, that is something that would be great. And it will be one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin will be forced to quit the war in Ukraine when it's no longer affordable.
But again, if we can't trust Putin, which we can't, I mean, and if we do, we're foolish. And I hope Trump doesn't fall for that looking in the eyes, I can see his soul kind of a thing, which was said before. If we can't trust him, but we do. Trump does fall into some kind of a crazy agreement to allow, say that, no, we agree, we're just going to pull out, and we're going to force Ukraine not to ever join NATO, at least for 10 years, maybe for forever. We're not going to supply them with any more weapons. Where's he going to go? Is he going to go, as most analysts think, he's going to continue on? He's going to continue on through the rest of Ukraine and then into Eastern Europe. Is this crazy, or do you believe that that's a reality? What would happen in that scenario?
If there is a peace agreement, I don't think that under Donald Trump, Putin would continue to invade Ukraine and break the agreement immediately. And the reason is simple. It takes time to rebuild the military. It takes time to rebuild their economy. So even if sanctions were to be lifted, as Putin would demand, it will take time to bounce back. So I don't think it would be immediate. And moreover, I think that Donald Trump would interpret it as a personal attack on him if Putin were to sign an agreement, shake his hand, and then go back on it. And in which case, I don't think anyone is really sure how Donald Trump would react. But given his general nature, I think there's a good chance that he'd really help Ukraine to kick Putin's ass.
Interesting. I can see how that would happen as well. But like Putin, I'll have to admit, I don't trust Donald Trump at all. He is very, very unpredictable. But I just don't see him as a good actor. I'm sorry. I just don't. Come January 20th, he's going to have to prove himself 100 billion times over to me to show that he's even a human being. And I really mean that. Maybe that sounds irrational, but this is not a good man. And so I don't know what's going to happen. I hope that everything you're saying and that I believe is true, that we can make Trump confront Putin to drive him out of Ukraine, or at least to stop what's going on right now and to strike a deal that's good for both Ukraine and the United States and Europe. I just don't know. This is a very scary time, Jason, as you know. I just don't know what's going to happen. I hope you're correct about Trump's ability to confront Putin, and that the fact if Putin goes back on his word on some kind of an agreement, that would really piss off Trump to the point of redoubling his efforts. But I just don't know. Any closing statements from you before we have to leave this for today?
No, I would just say the only thing I would say in parting is simply that Ukraine still needs the West support, and it needs everybody's support. And at this point, just to throw rocks at Trump is not going to help any of us. I think it's much more wise to give direction and say and to observe to others who perhaps don't realize, because the vast majority of people, I doubt they know the capital of Canada if they were to be asked on the spot. So if you help them figure out that these puzzle pieces fit together, that Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia are all intimately linked and they're all at war with America, it makes the argument for why supporting Ukraine is the most obvious thing that we should be doing.
I agree, Jason. I'm going to leave it at this point, on this point, rather. We all here in the West, especially the United States and Europe, need to support Ukraine now more than ever. And that doesn't stop with the fact that Donald Trump won the election. If anything, we need to redouble our efforts. So enough of finger pointing and threats. We need to get behind this government that's going to be led by Donald Trump, and and support Ukraine. That's really the bottom line. And so on that note, I agree with you. We'll leave it at that. Jason Smart, thank you so much again for joining me on the No Delusion Zone. And I know we'll do this again soon. So take care and stay safe.
Thanks, David.
If you liked the video that you just saw with Jason Smart, please subscribe to my channel. I need your support more than ever, especially post-American elections, because things are going to get very interesting around here very, very soon. And members of the loyal opposition, of which I consider myself one of the founding members, need your support. So please hit the subscribe button. Tell your friends to hit the subscribe button, as well as your family, your associates, and even your enemies. Tell MAGA and Trump supporters to hit the subscribe button so we can have a lively discussion here about the most important issues that affect everyone, not just here in America, certainly not here alone, but also obviously in Ukraine, in Europe, in all Western democracies. It's more important now than ever, folks, that I have your support so I can make many more videos like the one you just saw with Jason Smart. And while you're at it, go over to buymeacoffee.com and buy me a coffee. That also helps a lot. So please subscribe to my channel, buy me a coffee, and together, let's see our way through this nightmare. And with your support, we'll get there. Thanks, and as always, take care, stay safe, and stay sane.